Dermot, thanks for putting aside some time and hosting Wiston today and this beautiful tasting that we're going to have. To start, can you just fill me in a little bit on Wiston's history and yourself?
Hi, Guy. Happy New Year to you. I'm Dermot Sugrue. I'm the winemaker here at Wiston Estate, which is just about 8 kilometres north of the coast here, north of Worthing, on the South Downs in West Sussex. I've been part of this project right from the very, very start in 2006 when we planted the vineyard, in 2008 when we established the winery here at North Farm. It's pretty much coming on for a decade and a half of my involvement in this project. And it's remarkable how quickly time has flown, and what we've achieved here really in the 12 years that we've been producing wine. First vintage was 2008, so yeah, I guess we're into our 13th year of production here, and it's been quite an adventure, to say the very least.
I bet it has. And what about the family as well behind the vineyard?
Well, I was previously working at Nyetimber Vineyard, where I was their winemaker up until 2006, but I had met the Goring family in 2005. Now, that's Harry and Pip Goring, who have owned the Wiston Estate, large estate, about nearly 6,500 acres, here in West Sussex, and they'd been in their family since 1743. So very, very much a family agricultural estate on the South Downs. And I met Harry and Pip. Pip is just this wonderful lady from South Africa originally. She was born there. And she came here as an 18-year-old bride when she married Harry Goring, quintessential Englishman, in Cape Town in 1972, and they moved here immediately. And Pip had grown up in the heartland of the Cape, around places like Franschhoek and Hermanus, and one of the first things she thought about when she saw these there's chalk south-facing slopes on the downs here was Harry, can we plant a vineyard? Which wasn't very, a hell of a lot more popular today to suggest, let's plant a vineyard in England. Back in 1972, not very many of the agronomists and the farm advisors were keen to rush ahead to plant vines into the chalk here. But we met each other when I was at Nyetimber, and they expressed a desire to plant a vineyard, and that's how it happened from there. Once I had a look at the land, and we put our heads together and decided to set out on this project.
And here you are.
Yeah, exactly. Here we are.
We had over Christmas. I had just quickly to we had the Magnum that you guys brought up recently. It was just phenomenal, absolutely fabulous, beautiful wine, beautiful wine. Just wanted to get that one in whilst I remembered.
Yeah, it's very, very special, that wine, actually. Those it pretty much has consolidated the style of the vintage cuvee that we make these days. Was the cuvee really was the first wine. The vintage cuvee was the first wine style that I created here. And it was a Chardonnay dominant wine at the beginning of its life, 2008, 2009. Then in 2010, I started to just look to make a more, because I brought out a Blanc de Blanc for the first time. I wanted to differentiate the cuvee by making it a Pinot dominant wine. And since that, initially 2010, but really 2013 vintage, it's gone full bore, that Pinot dominant style, 100% old barrel fermentation. And that the 13 Magnum really is the best exemplification of that wine, because once you have a Magnum that is 6 years on lees, or rather I think it's 5 years on lees, but then considerable time on cork as well, you start to get into some really, really interesting territory for English sparkling wine.
Well, yeah, as you said, I think it's been a great achievement, and it was a great way for us to celebrate Christmas. So thank you. Which wine would you like to start with then, Dermot?
Okay, well, I think this is the absolutely the most appropriate wine for us to start with, and this is the Wiston Brut non-vintage. So this is a cuvee. Again, where the two Pinot grape varieties are to the fore here in this wine. This is our largest production wine. We make it every year, and we use reserve wine to make a proportion of this wine. And the vintage that we're on at the moment is, or at least the vintage that this wine is based on at the moment, is the 2015 vintage. So we've got Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier in equal proportions. So more or less a third, a third, a third. Yeah, so it's actually a very a healthy quantity of Pinot Meunier in this blend. This has got more Meunier in it than any of our other wines. I love the balance of fruit, pure fruit component that Meunier gives this wine. But overall, the wine is still very, very linear. It's very, very true to Wiston style, very chalk dominated, though not all of the grapes are coming from chalk vineyards here. It's an assemblage of a number of different vineyards and different sources of fruit. But the wine manages to kind of walk that tightrope of having this lovely expressive fruit, plump fruit, ripe fruit character to it. Then with a little bit of solidity that's coming from the Pinot Noir, again a third of the wine, and then this lovely driving freshness of the Chardonnay, which is absolutely key to the wine. What's giving it a lot of volume and dimension and complexity is this reserve wine. Now we're 40% reserve wine in the blend.
I think that the main thing that I get from it is the smoothness. It's a very well-rounded, sparkling wine. And I imagine a lot of that goes back to the blending that you were talking about and the processes. It's very soft, and I mean that in a good way, in the sense that, again, it's smooth, it's rounded, it's very well balanced. That word keeps coming up to me.
It's I think a big key here is well, the quality of the fruit in 2015 was wonderful. It was a concentrated vintage, and we'll see this in the vintage cuvee 15 and the Blanc Blanc 15 that we have here coming up next. Compact, concentrated, ripe fruit, a lot of density to the fruit character in that year, because it was a small year, 2015. It was on the back of a very large 13, a very large 14, and for a number of reasons, the vines throughout the country didn't produce as much in 2015. It's poor flowering. I think some people, though not us, may have been affected by frost. But it certainly meant reduced yields everywhere. But, very often, we have such variability in UK climate and weather that, it helps promote this whole diversity of vintage variation. And we see this here in the 15 base of this wine. But, the key part of this wine really is the reserve wines, which are making up a large proportion of this wine because the vintage itself was small. In larger vintages, such as the 2014, there was a much smaller component of reserve wine in the blend. But here we've got 40% of the reserve wine. And it's important to realize what the reserve wine is, because it's a perpetual solera of every previous vintage here at Wiston, which is held in one tank. So it's a blend of 13, there's no 12 actually, because we didn't pick any 12, but sorry, it's 2014, 13, 11, 10, 9, and 2008 is all combined in this perpetual reserve solera tank, on stainless steel, on its lees. And it tastes absolutely crazy. It's a crazy tank of wine to taste. So it gives an awful lot to this Brut non-vintage style.
How do you think it performs as a wine that is you could argue, an introduction to Wiston? Because that's what a lot of the cuvées are.
Yeah, it's. I think this is it's a great symbol or emblem or introduction to what you see represented in the rest of the vintage wines.
Sure.
I'm always looking for linearity in the wines and focus and direction. Now we get that because of the chalk soils that we're largely working with on this one here, but absolutely with the vintage wines because they're all single vineyard chalk sites. But yeah, that kind of precision and focus is key. And then when you can build the rest of the wine, so it gives, as you say, that smoothness, that you know, a sense of weight, but of course you don't want the wine to be heavy in any way. And a degree of dimensions, multi-dimensional characters coming into the wine from the reserve. It's very, very important. I love making this wine. It's a lot of fun to make this wine because it's a wine really that needs to be constructed every year. Yeah, I do like the Wiston Brut vintage is a cracker of a wine, and in many instances it's been regarded as the kind of go-to English sparkling wine in terms of value for money, and we're really, really proud about that here.
And I think, as we were saying, it's a very important wine for a vineyard, a winery to have the cuvee on point, as it were. And hearing you talk about that, it's very evident how much energy you put into it and how important it is, and that shows.
Yeah, no, it's great, and over the years we've cultivated more avenues to get, you know, great quality fruit into this wine, and it's a pleasure to see it grow. You know, the production of this has grown in recent years as well, not yet released. You know, the idea very much with this wine, as is through all of the Wiston range, is to age the wines for as long as possible. So this wine was bottled in 2006. So we're releasing the wine, you know, 4.5 years after vintage, and that can only be a very good thing.
Absolutely. Shall we move on to the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So here we're going to our vintage cuvee. So as I said, vines planted on a pure chalk vineyard site in 2006. So what are we now? The vines are, you know, heading towards, they're more than a decade and a half old, 16, 17 years old. This is the original site. We have planted 2 more vineyards on chalk here at Wiston in 2017, but this is by far and away the oldest of the sites. We're 2015 vintage as well, so sharing the same characteristics as I spoke about, you know, small yield, dense, concentrated fruit, terrific ripeness of that fruit. There was disease pressure in 2015, some botrytis pressure at the end of it, but we managed to pick all of these grapes without any damage from botrytis. So the wines are showing a terrific ability to age. And as I mentioned earlier on, the style that we very much developed from 2010, but really took it forward with the 2013 vintage cuvee, is 100% barrel fermentation in old Burgundy barrels. So the wine is very, very briefly in stainless steel. The grapes are pressed in a traditional coquillard press, basket press. It's hard work, but delivers lovely, lovely purity of fruit in the juice. Yeah. And gives the wine, when we use the coquillard press, and then using, you know, barrel fermentation and aging for the wine, it gives the wine a great ability to actually age and withstand oxidation during its life by introducing it to potential sources of oxidation early in the career of the wine, shall we say. But very, very briefly in stainless steel, just for the juice to settle and just for the fermentation to be allowed to start, and then it's transferred into old barrels.
I think that the main thing that I noticed immediately was how much softer it is, much smoother and rounder. And I think that probably follows on from what you were saying in terms of the different processes that it's gone through. still a really good body as well. I was quite surprised at that, considering that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the goal is with the barrel is never to actually introduce any overt oak flavors into the wine. If I get those, then I'm maybe not so happy, or rather a better way of saying it is if people don't comment and don't pick up any oak on the wine, then I'm very, very happy indeed, because the idea is to be as discreet as possible with any oak flavors, but primarily it's the texture that we're looking for. And barrels are amazing at transforming the texture of English sparkling wine, in my view, because we all know that tea is a very, very important or indeed vital aspect of English grapes. And, you know, rather than being afraid of acidity, I tend to embrace the acidity and showcase it. But barrels are a perfect tool to incorporate that acidity into the wine, to integrate it, and give the wine that silky, deep, again, multi-dimensional texture and detail that you get from fermenting and aging in multiple barrels of different provenance and different age and different coopers. It produces something really, really interesting. And there's no doubt it's very much adding to what we get from the vineyard by using all of these barrels. But it's a very, very specific style that I wanted to achieve. And the wines are just showing a capacity to age really, really well using this style.
What is it you expect them to achieve then over a bit further aging? I mean, my immediate impression was how soft and smooth it is, particularly, you know, after the first one.
Well, I think, wow. The 13 is the perfect example of where this wine can go. We still have some bottles of the 2013, which was, you know, it was remarkable what 2013 vintage cuvee achieved, because it really, really stood out as a very different style of English wine by being 100% in barrel, because it won the trophy for Decanter Trophy back in 2017, and in the same year it won the IWSC trophy for Best English Wine. Now that's quite remarkable for one wine to dominate two large competitions in excess of 100 English sparkling wines in the same one, which kind of proves the uniqueness of this style. And then we know now from tasting the Magnums and from tasting the 13, you know, 8 years after vintage, that these wines really, really age very, very well. Very, very well indeed. And maybe that's because of the decision to block the malolactic fermentation, you know. As I said, the inoculation effectively with oxygen early in the wine's life. We know that this is giving wines an extra longevity. Yeah, it would be interesting to see in another 10 years how these wines are actually holding up. I expect them to be still in really, really good form a decade from now.
I think, following on from what you're saying, what's immediately that I noticed is just how much smoother it is. They're both very well balanced wines, but going back to the process that you're talking about within the winemaking, I think that's added this extra layer to it that is a beautiful mouthfeel, and it's just subtle though. That's what I like about it. It's subtle. It's not punching for your attention, if that makes sense. And I think that's a good thing, because you don't want a wine that's too acidic or too bold. This is mellow and balanced.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is, it's not just fermentation in the barrel, which of course is absolutely crucial. Rather than fermenting in stainless steel and then putting the wine into barrel, you get very, very different results, and you far less subtlety if you do that. So it's actually knitting the wine to the barrel during the initial fermentation, and then aging the wine for a long time on its lees in barrel. Because this typically will have been in barrel from November after harvest to around June the following year. So what's that? That's a good 8 months that the wine is in barrel. It's very, very composed. It doesn't get racked. It sits there on its lees. Barrels are simply just topped up when they need topping up. And the SO2 regime is generally quite low because the wines are naturally protected in a very, very cold place and sitting on their wineries. So I think it gives the wine a good period of élevage, as the French say. You know, the wine can grow up and realize itself to a certain level of character before, of course, it then goes through the tirage and it's rejuvenated by fermentation in the bottle, and it goes on its own particular journey after that.
Do you think it's got much aging potential? How much further do you think it can go?
I think this wine here, the 15, this has got really, really good aging potential. There's some elements of honey that are coming through on the nose, which is indicating that this is 1/3 Chardonnay here. It's indicating that Chardonnay is starting to stretch its legs, really. It's more kind of Pinot dominant, or it has been up until now. There's always a bit of Pinot Meunier in here, because Pinot Meunier is a fantastic bridge between the Pinot Noir, which is giving all of that structure and the carpentry, if you like, to the wine. And then there's about 20% of Pinot Meunier, which gives that wonderful fruit. And then the Chardonnay, which is giving that drive and focus. But it's a really well-structured wine, and yeah, I think again it's going to be fascinating to see how it develops. But I see no reason why this won't reward putting in your cellar for 4 years, 6 years, 8 years.
Right.
We'll just have to see.
So it's still got a bit of a softening down, as it were, or mellow out, a bit more balancing and calm down.
Yeah, I mean, there's nice. What I love about barrel fermentation is, especially with English sparkling wine varieties, is you get this energy from the acidity and from the low pH of the wine, and the creamy textures and mouthfeel that the barrels create or enhance. They knit together the energy of the malic acid, of the tartaric acid that's in there, and they keep it there in terms of a kind of a store of fireworks for the future. And I think this is something that we've seen develop, and people say that the Wiston wines are very, very distinctive in say a blind lineup of wines. And I think because of the nature of the chalk, the low pH of the wines, and this old oak influence that is maybe creating this. They're exciting wines that tend to grow in excitement as they age.
I think that's very important, following on from what you were saying, which we did touch on briefly on the first one, is the acidity and then the ability to age, and how important those two are to the wine, and then therefore the enjoyment of it, because it is a very real key balance that.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, we also there's many ways to manage acidity in winemaking, such as a malolactic fermentation, encouraging the acidities to soften by using microbes in the wine. It happens naturally, or you can inoculate to do that. But also, age in tank and barrel and in the bottle is going to give a very definite softening of the acidity over time. But another way that you can kind of disguise that maybe over-prominent acidity, or maybe acidity that you think won't be perfect for your customer, is to use higher amounts of dosage in the wine. And that's all very well. I've got no problem with that whatsoever, as long as the wines are in balance. Yeah. And what we find here, I found over the years, is that, having a relatively low dosage, somewhere in the region of 7 grams per litre for our Brut Non vintage, and here we're at 8 grams per litre for the vintage cuvee, works very, very well. It's not a super low dosage, but nor is it a more traditional, 10, 12 grams per litre of dosage. And it hits that really nice balance. And for me, the balance of the correct dosage is when you simply taste the wine and you don't think about dosage. Exactly. It just doesn't even come into your mind. Then you know that the wine, that you've hit a point of balance where the wine just kind of shines and sings.
But I think, as you say, that is the important part within winemaking. Sparkling wine is balance, is getting everything on par with each other. Because some of the wines are occasionally, particularly in some of the cooler climates, you can have too much acidity or there's too much punch. And it's good to have wines that you don't necessarily need to pair it with food to calm that down or need something else to counteract that. It's great to have wines that you can just enjoy for what they are. And again, that goes back to what you're saying with the balance within these wines in particular. So absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I'm always searching for, and we'll see it in all of the wines here, but particularly it's evident in these first two wines, is a fruit element, but also a savory element, also a salinity that's in the wines. And this is coming from the soils, but also not being obsessed about fruit character in the wines, allowing other things to develop, allowing little kind of wild things to happen in the wines, because that happens every time you use barrels. You're going to get the same wine into different barrels, and you get this extraordinary array of differentiation, or small differentiation in the wines. And that's always very, very interesting indeed, because it's the sum of its parts. Even if it's a single vineyard wine from one year, it's the sum of lots of different component parts. And this is giving an interesting balance of this, sweetness, savory, saline character, mature flavors, freshness, a suggestion of youth, even though the wines have got considerable age to them. All of these things are coming together in a really interesting way, which we can see now in the Blanc Blanc, in the Blanc Blanc 15, which is this little baby here, right. Blanc Blanc 2015. So again, same vintage 15. We're using the best Chardonnay to go into our Blanc Blanc. So it's a selection of the ripest fruit, absolutely the cleanest fruit. We know which part of the vineyard historically, since 2008, since the first vintage at Wiston, that is producing the highest quality fruit, because we've got a lot of different, not so many different rootstocks. There's only 4 different rootstocks throughout the vineyard, but there's quite a few different clones. We've seen this pattern right from the very, very start, which clones are producing, the best barrels, the best tanks. So we know generally what works, and it tends to prove itself every year. It also happens to be the steepest and the chalkiest part of the vineyard. Very, very, very low quantity of topsoil there. Very stony, very flinty. Consequently, very few weeds actually grow on the steepest part of the slope. So I noticed something really, really interesting back in 2015. In January 16, I remember I'd been away over the Christmas holiday period, and I came back with, I taste the wines very, very regularly when they're in tank, when they're in barrel, particularly after vintage. But I hadn't tasted the wines for about 3 weeks, and I came back. I tasted the barrels, and particularly the Chardonnay barrels. And it struck me how this 2015 was different from the previous vintages like 14 and 13, because in the barrels I could taste a very, very distinct minerality, which was a relatively new component, I'd suggest, actually. And I remember thinking about it at the time, but in 2015, these vines were on the cusp of being a decade old. So the roots of the vines had pretty much colonized it's the average depth of the soil of the clay loam root flints is probably about between 15 and 20 centimeters. So it's quite narrow. So in that 9-10 years, the roots had actually colonized all of that area before then being forced to punch down into the chalk, into the initially fractured chalk, and then quite dense chalk underneath that, because there's competition coming from the roots laterally from the vines either side, and there's no more soil to use up topsoil, which is the easy option for a vine, of course. Yeah. So they were plunging down, and maybe this is why the wine was starting to display a heightened sense of minerality or mineral expression from this vintage. And I was certainly able to taste it in the barrel. And I was able to taste the nuances between the different rootstocks in the barrel as well. Really, really interesting. It was a bit of a light bulb moment. And I suppose, you need these, you need time for terroir to reveal itself. And you need to, make stylistically similar wines in terms of their construction and from that same vineyard for several years before you start to notice what the principal or primary characteristics of your soil type are.
And I think it's also important to note that the detail that is required, which, as you're saying, is the specifics of the soil types and how old the vines are and where the roots are spreading. And then if you're able to pick up on that, which obviously you have been, you'll be able to draw out these extra elements within the wine and understand more what's happening.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's, it's a great kind of exercise to either prove or disprove every year.
Of course.
And a great kind of yardstick for expanding the range of wines, because these wines have been fantastically successful over recent years, and it's necessary that we needed to plant some more vineyard sites here. So we planted an additional 2.5 hectares of pure Chardonnay in 2017. So we got the first fruit from that last year in 2020. And we planted then another hectare on a different west-facing, south and west-facing site here at North Farm around the winery that same year as well, and that produced its first Pinot Noir. But the new Chardonnay site that we've planted, it's called Broadwoods. The quality of the chalk is almost identical. There's probably a kilometre between the two sites, the original 2006 site and the Broadwood site planted in 17. But it's slightly lower elevation by about 30 meters. I suppose it's quite significant, really. The initial site is 100 meters above sea level, and then the Broadwoods is 70 meters above sea level. But it's got fantastic protection from prevailing winds. So there's a great sense of, once you're at the Findon site, and then you travel over to the Broadwood site, and on some of the spectacularly hot days that we had this year, you move into the Broadwood site and you suddenly think, wow, I think I may need some of my factor 30 here. Once you go into that vineyard, just the sense of heat that was there is remarkable. And I think this is going to be really interesting from the 2020 vintage, having a combination of this original Chardonnay from the Findon site with the Broadwoods fruit, which I think is going to be, well, certainly in 2020 on the exotic scale with the levels of ripeness that we have there. And it's a great extension from one to the other that, it gives you the confidence from having made wine on a particular vineyard for 12 years to then branch out onto similar terroirs, but with slight little differences to them. And maybe even a more superior site. Time will tell. Oh,
are you still there? Oh, sorry, Dermot, I lost you then for a moment.
I know I lost you. You're frozen like a statue. No worries. We're back?
Yes, we're back. So I wanted to carry on from what you were saying there. Do you think there's the potential for possibly a single vineyard site then?
Well, certainly. I mean, all of the Wiston vintage wines, they are single single vineyard wines.
Okay.
But certainly with Broadwoods, I think we will see. I'd like to just combine the wine at the start, to combine them, because the Chardonnay from these vineyards, they go into numerous places, so they always go into the cuvee. They'll end up going into the cuvee, the Brut vintage. They'll end up going into the rosé vintage wines as well, and maybe the Blanc Blanc non-vintage, or rather certainly the Blanc Blanc non-vintage. So they've got many routes to go. Whether or not doing a single vineyard of Broadwood Chardonnay and a single vineyard of Findon Chardonnay, No, I think it would be a little bit too complicated for the time being. My life is complex enough. Although maybe, you know, what we could do is in alternate years, maybe release wines from those individual sites, certainly from Broadwoods. That's a good idea, Guy. Actually, I'm going to get my thinking cap on, and I'll report back to you in 10 months' time, okay?
Dude, I can't wait. So let's move on to the next one.
Again, just on that Blanc de Blanc, wonderful honeyed character is approaching into the wine, and sometimes honey can be an indication that the wine is aging quite quickly. But I think in this instance, it's actually part of that richness and concentration of the vintage in 2015. I still think it's got great acidity and great legs to continue aging very well for some time.
It's had a good development on it, but as you say, that it's not reached the end of that yet.
No way, not at all, not at all. Okay, so this is our vintage rosé. So this is 2014 vintage rosé. Again, all of the fruit coming from the original Wiston vineyard, Findon Park vineyard. 2014 was a big year in terms of the volume of fruit, the quantity of fruit that we got from the vineyard. It was historically the biggest yield that we had. Perfect flowering and really, really good growing conditions. In fact, you know, over the years, prior to 2018, which is the much heralded vintage in the UK of recent years, 2014 was certainly a game changer for many vineyards who had maybe struggled with low yields or disease in many of the preceding years, but 14 was pretty much perfect. Wonderful flowering, great fruit set, hardly any adverse rain events that would cause disease or very, very challenging events towards the end of harvest. And almost every vineyard brought in a big crop of very, very healthy grapes. On the back of a very, very successful 2011 vintage rosé that we had made, I decided to make a 14 rosé. And it's turned out to be a really, really fascinating wine. Very, very fascinating wines. We're forced to release this wine when it was quite young. So probably in about 2016 we released this wine when it only had maybe 18 months or least. And it was a little bit of a Marmite wine, actually. There was a lot of power and character, individual character in the being expressed in the red wine component of the wine, which delighted some people and was just a little bit strange for other people. One thing we did find about this wine was that it unlike almost all of the other wines, and you know, certainly most sparkling wines out there, this is actually a terrific accompaniment to red meat. Things like game or duck and even lamb and beef. This wine has been it's absolutely wonderful with them. So in a flight of Wiston wines, and certainly with food matching, this is something that works really, really well with a red meat course. Over the years, this wine has really turned into something much more elegant. So it is very, 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 very powerful with lots of kind of Christmas notes. Things like cardamom and clove were very, very apparent in the wine, which is really unusual. And these very, very powerful primary flavors have receded over recent years, and the wine is showing itself in a much more elegant light at the moment. And I must say, I really like this wine now. 6 years after vintage, I love this wine more and more every time I taste it, actually, as it gets into its maturity, which I suppose again is a great example of why you should be patient with English sparkling wines, because they really do reward once they start to get into that 4, 5, 6 years after vintage period phase of their life.
as you say, it's about letting some of the acidity calm down, so you get a better balance of the fruit, and there's more texture in the wines. And this rosé really, really displays that. It's beautiful mouthfeel. When you were talking about food and some of the intricacies of the wine, I immediately wanted some pâté with this on toast. I just thought that would be lovely. It would cut through the slightly the fattiness of the pâté. I think it'd be delicious. You know, the red berries and it's the texture. That's the main thing that I got from this, was a really delicate texture. There's very well achieved.
But there's still a robustness of character about the wine, isn't there? It remains very, very individual. And
the firmness that's coming through. Sorry.
Yeah. It's rosés are difficult wines to make. For me, it's the most challenging wine to make, a rosé, because you've got a lot of different criteria that you want to get right, and not least is the color of the wine, because we all want rosé to have a beautiful color. And that is easier said than done, because there's a lot of guesswork involved in how color will develop, because the color that you achieve at the point of blending, if indeed that's how you're making the rosé wines, that this is how this is made, it's not a saignée, it's a rosé d'assemblage. And the color that you achieve at the point of blending, before your tirage, before your bottling, that's it. You can't go back. So once you've got your color at that point, you just hope that it's going to be correct, because you'll have a loss of color throughout the years of lees aging. So you need to start with something a little bit higher than what you want to actually achieve, and hope that you haven't gone too high or gone too low with that color at the outset. I'm really pleased with the color that this wine is at 6 years after vintage. We're going into its 7th year after vintage, because it's still got a lovely coppery hue to it. It's not going brown. It hasn't faded away, so the wine looks like a Blanc Noir. You still have lovely, lovely red fruit colors in there. And it smells like it looks, which is always a good thing with rosé.
Again, something that you mentioned about all of the Wiston's wines is the ability to age, and how they still have potential to come, and there's still a lot more there, which I think is key to allowing some of the acidity to calm down, the fruit to come through, and also the further complexities within the wines, which is what you're mentioning. And I agree that this feels like there's still a lot more to come from it.
Yeah. It's the magic of lees. The yeast is so important for so many reasons in sparkling wine production. It's not just the giver of alcohol and fermentation. It's that deposit that is there all the time that your wine is in the tank, and certainly in a barrel. But it's so importantly during the lees aging phase, when the wine is in contact with its yeast lees. The way that the fruit gets complexed by these different yeast aromas over time is an extraordinary and surprising sense of wonder. Every year that I make wine, it's remarkable what we can do in the UK. There's no doubt about that.
And I think it's, we've proved it. That's the point. It's no longer news, as it were. There's enough wine out there that's got some aging, that's had the development, the quality is there and able to compete, which is what we're talking about. Wines that do compete.
Yeah. It is. It's, I've been making wine in England now for something like 18 years, and over that time, I feel like one of the grand old men of English sparkling wine. Hopefully I'm still only in the middle of my career, but we've seen so many important producers arrive in the last 2 decades, and it's great now that we've got this kind of body of work of those producers, that we can look at wines that are 5 years old, 10 years old, 15 years old. This is really educational stuff for all of us, and it's great now that we've reached a level where we can share a lot of our experiences, our successes, our little disasters, because we all have our little disasters in life.
Learning.
It's absolutely, every day is a school day. Every year is a school year. We're seeing such variation. Every year is simply different to every other year. And the longer I go on making wine, the more emphasis, or the more correct I feel that is.
Well, Dermot, these wines have all been wonderful. I mean, we already knew that anyway, but it's just great to hear you speak about Wiston and your approach to winemaking and the individual elements that have been found in each sparkling wine. What's coming next for you, and what's coming next for Wiston?
Okay, it's exciting times, very, very exciting times. Just on the wine front, we've got a fantastic new Blanc Noir vintage 2014 coming out. So same vintage as this, the Rosé. It's a blend of mostly Pinot Noir. Our previous Blanc Noir 2010 was an extraordinary wine and pretty much, you know, won every competition at the WineGB Awards in 2018, including winning us Winery of the Year. But that was 100% Pinot Noir. In 2014, this Blanc Noir is 2/3 Pinot Noir, 1/3 Meunier. Again, 100% in barrels. And Blanc Noir is very, very, very suited to long lees aging, I find, in the UK. The wines sometimes when they're young are extremely forward, very, very accessible, very approachable. But then if you let them sit in the cellar for a longer period of time, they kind of go through a close cycle and then turn into something, metamorphose into something extraordinary once they're 5-6 years after vintage. So this has been the case with this Blanc Noir 2014. We've disgorged it at a very, very low dosage. So it's effectively a Brut Nature. Something less than 2 grams per liter of dosage, because it just suits that profile of that wine. So that's going to be coming out soon. But in closer to home, shall we say, we're opening a visitor center here at Wiston. It's still, the place outside the winery is pretty much a construction site and has been for several months now. There's been some challenges with COVID, as you can imagine. But pretty much in this summer, towards the end of the summer to 2021, we're going to be opening our doors with a pretty cool visitor center here, and we're so looking forward to it. We really, really are, because we're a hospitable bunch here at Wiston, and we just can't wait to open our doors and welcome people in to taste wine, drink wine, eat feasts, and enjoy themselves.
Oh, Dermot, I wish it was there already. You've made it sound amazing. I mean, what more could we want?
We'll tap glasses in person, yeah?
We will. Thank you so much, Dermot. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Guy. Take good care. Happy New Year to you. It's been a pleasure.
And you.